"Don't let him take another bite," the little girl said, her voice barely rising above the clink of silverware, but sharp enough to slice through the laughter in the room. Lily Carter stood between the billionaire and the wedding cake, both small hands pressed against the edge of the table, as if holding back something invisible and dangerous. The guests chuckled at first, assuming it was a child's imagination, until she pointed at the frosting with a trembling finger and whispered, "There's a bottle behind it. Don't eat it." Richard Harrington froze mid-motion, the knife hovering above the cake like time itself had stalled, while someone behind her muttered that the maid's child needed to be removed before she ruined everything. It was supposed to be a perfect evening inside the Harrington estate in Connecticut, where chandeliers cast warm light over white linen tables and guests spoke in the soft, confident tones of people who never expected to be interrupted. Outside, a late autumn rain tapped gently against the tall glass windows, blurring the gardens into moving shadows. Inside, Lily Carter stood near the dessert table, her small shoes still damp from running through the kitchen hallway she wasn't supposed to enter. The smell of vanilla frosting filled the air, but beneath it, faint and wrong, she kept noticing something metallic, like medicine left open too long. Richard Harrington had arrived late, as he often did, still adjusting the cuff of his white shirt and scanning his phone for messages he had not answered. At 49, he carried the kind of presence that made conversations pause when he entered a room, though tonight his attention was split between polite greetings and the quiet pressure of a board meeting waiting after dessert. He barely noticed the child at first, assuming she was part of the household staff's shadowed world, until she stepped directly into his path with an urgency that did not belong in a room like this. "Excuse me?" one of the event coordinators said quickly, reaching for Lily's arm. "Sweetheart, you need to step back." But Lily didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on the cake stand, where the frosting shimmered under the light like it had been carefully staged for attention, too perfect, too smooth. "I saw her," she said instead, quieter now, as if speaking louder would make it worse. "The woman with the white gloves. She had a bottle. A small white bottle." Richard paused, not because he believed her, but because something in her certainty disrupted the rhythm of the room. He had learned over the years to recognize panic, manipulation, and performance, yet what stood in front of him felt none of those things. Still, the room did not wait for his doubt. A soft wave of discomfort moved through the guests, the kind that comes when wealth is interrupted by something it cannot immediately categorize. Someone laughed again, uncomfortable, suggesting the child had watched too many movies. But Lily's gaze dropped to the back edge of the dessert table. Between the folded linen skirts and stacked serving trays, a corner of white plastic peeked out, too clean to belong there, too deliberate to be forgotten. A pill bottle half hidden, its label turned inward as if it had been placed carefully to avoid being seen too early. Richard's expression shifted slightly, not into belief but into attention, the kind he reserved for numbers that did not add up. The room seemed to narrow around that small object, while Lily's voice, almost breaking now, added the final thread. She said it would only take one bite, and as Richard leaned just slightly forward, the label on the bottle came into view, showing a name that did not belong anywhere near his house. The room did not react all at once. It reacted in layers, like reality itself was trying to decide whether to believe what had just been said. Richard Harrington did not touch the pill bottle yet. He only stared at it, his hand slowly lowering from the cake knife as if it had suddenly become heavier than it should be. Behind him, someone laughed too softly, then stopped when no one joined in. Lily Carter stood frozen in place, her fingers still gripping the edge of the dessert table, watching Richard's eyes move from the frosting to the hidden gap behind the linen skirt where the bottle had been partially tucked. A server stepped forward, instinctively trying to adjust the tablecloth, but Richard lifted one hand. Not a command, not yet, just a pause that froze the motion midair. "Don't," he said quietly, not looking away from the object. A few feet away, the room's sound softened into ordinary life trying to continue. Glassware being reset, a faint fork tapping a plate, someone clearing their throat near the chandelier glow, but none of it felt stable anymore. Richard finally reached for his phone instead of the bottle, taking a single photo, then another, his expression tightening in a way that didn't belong to panic but to calculation. "Who had access to this table before guests arrived?" he asked, voice low, controlled. No one answered immediately. A catering supervisor stepped forward too quickly, insisting everything had been checked, everything signed off, everything standard. But Lily shook her head sharply. "She was here earlier," she said, almost whispering now. "The woman with the white gloves. I remember her perfume." That detail shifted something small in the air. Richard looked down at her for the first time since the interruption began, not as a disturbance, but as a witness. The girl's coat sleeves were slightly too long, her shoes damp from running through service corridors, and in her hand she was holding something that did not belong in a child's grip. A folded napkin with a faint yellow stain at the edge. She noticed his gaze and hesitated, then unfolded it just enough to reveal a smudge of frosting she had wiped earlier. "It tasted weird when I got close," she said softly, like it was obvious, like anyone should have noticed. At the far end of the hall, a TV mounted above a sidebar played muted evening news, flickering light across polished wood, while the faint hum of a dishwasher echoed from the kitchen below. Someone in the staff corridor briefly opened a door, and for a second the smell of hot water and detergent spilled into the ballroom before being shut away again. Richard stepped slightly away from the table now, lifting his wrist to check something on his phone. Security feed timestamps, entry logs, something only he could see clearly. His thumb paused on a notification. A door access record showing a brief entry into the prep kitchen at 3:17 p.m. that had no assigned name attached. "Check the internal camera for the prep corridor," he said finally into the phone, voice still calm, but now unmistakably colder. The catering supervisor stiffened. Lily, meanwhile, hadn't moved, but her eyes had shifted, not to the cake anymore, but to the edge of the kitchen doorway where shadows of staff still passed, unaware that they were now being watched differently. A faint vibration came from somewhere under the tablecloth again, the pill bottle lightly shifting as the linen was disturbed by movement. And as Richard's screen refreshed with a missing 6-minute gap in the footage, he looked up slowly and said, almost to himself, "Why would anyone erase 6 minutes before serving the cake?" The silence that followed Richard Harrington's question did not feel empty. It felt measured, as if the room itself was waiting for someone to answer correctly. The catering supervisor shifted her weight slightly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, sometimes the system glitches," she said carefully, too quickly, as though the words had been prepared before the question was asked. Richard didn't look at her. His attention stayed locked on the phone screen where the security footage timeline showed a clean, deliberate gap, exactly 6 minutes erased between 3:11 and 3:17 p.m., right before the cake had been placed. Lily Carter had moved closer without realizing it, her small hand now resting on the edge of a serving tray, eyes fixed on the same screen as if she could read what adults were trying not to say out loud. "That's when she was there," Lily said quietly, not accusing, just stating it like a memory she couldn't forget. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, controlled, but something in his posture had changed, the kind of stillness that came when calculation replaced disbelief. He turned slightly toward the kitchen corridor where staff moved in and out with practiced efficiency, each of them now suddenly too aware of being observed. A server walked past carrying a tray of empty glasses, then paused when Richard's gaze briefly landed on her wrist. A plastic key card was clipped there, labeled Prep Access Temporary. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Who authorized temporary access for prep today?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it cut through the room. No one answered immediately. Lily tugged lightly at his sleeve before she seemed to realize she had done it. When he looked down, she hesitated, then pulled a folded paper from inside her coat pocket. It was wrinkled, edges softened from being held too tightly. "I saw this on the counter earlier," she said. She dropped it. Richard took it carefully, unfolding it just enough to see a printed receipt from a medical supply pharmacy less than 3 miles away. Timestamped 2:48 p.m., paid in cash. One item line was circled in faint ink. Anti-nausea tablets. Quantity: 1 bottle. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't speak. He only looked toward the kitchen again, where the same catering supervisor was now speaking too quickly into her headset, turning her body away as if shielding her words from the room. A faint vibration sounded again, this time from a nearby service cart where a staff phone had been left face down. The screen lit briefly with a notification preview. Voicemail deleted, 3:09 p.m. Richard saw it before anyone else did. He didn't touch it, just memorized the timing. Lily, however, had already noticed something else. Her gaze had drifted toward the staff entrance where a white linen coat hung slightly out of place. Sleeve turned outward just enough to reveal a faint stain near the cuff, like someone had washed their hands too quickly. "That's her coat," Lily said under her breath. "She always smells like that." Richard finally turned fully toward the kitchen staff now, his voice still controlled but lower. "I want every access log from the last hour," he said. "And I want the prep corridor footage recovered, not summarized." The catering supervisor nodded too fast again, stepping back as if distance could soften scrutiny. But Lily didn't move. She was watching the coat, not the people, as if something about it mattered more than their reactions. Then she spoke again, softer this time, almost uncertain. "She wasn't supposed to be there at 3:17, she said, "because I saw her in the hallway at 3:08, and she was already holding the bottle then." Richard looked at her sharply. "Are you sure about the time?" he asked. Lily nodded immediately. "The kitchen clock is fast. I watched it when I was waiting for water." That small detail, the kind no one else would bother noticing, hung in the air for a moment longer than it should have. Richard's gaze shifted back to the phone, comparing timestamps again, recalculating everything silently. The erased 6 minutes were no longer just a gap, they were a window. And as the catering supervisor instinctively reached to adjust her sleeve, hiding the faint outline of something rectangular beneath it, Richard realized the first missing minutes weren't missing at all. They had already been used. The moment Richard Harrington asked for full access logs, the room shifted in a way Lily Carter could feel before she understood it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, like polished doors closing a fraction slower, like voices lowering just enough to exclude her. A man in a dark suit stepped between Lily and the catering staff, smiling politely as he bent slightly to her height. "Sweetheart, why don't you wait over there with security?" he said in a voice that sounded kind, practiced, final. 2 security officers had already appeared near the edge of the ballroom, not touching her, but positioning themselves in a way that turned space into instruction. Lily didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the folded receipt in her pocket, the edges now soft from being pressed too many times in her small hand. Richard noticed immediately. "She stays," he said simply, not raising his voice. That was enough to make the security officers hesitate. But another woman stepped forward, elegant, composed, wearing a pale gold dress that matched the tone of control in her voice. "Richard, this is a private investigation space now," she said gently, careful not to sound emotional. "We can't have a child influencing interpretations of technical logs and kitchen errors." She looked at Lily briefly, then back at him. "This is how rumors start in environments like this." Lily lifted her chin slightly at that, not in defiance, but in correction. "It's not a rumor," she said quietly. She changed her gloves 3 times before the cake came out. The room tightened around that sentence. Not because it was loud, but because it was specific. One of the catering staff shifted too quickly, adjusting her headset again, voice whispering something about procedure. The woman in gold smiled slightly, as if calming a situation that didn't need escalation. "Children remember patterns incorrectly under stress," she said softly. "That's well documented." Richard didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved from Lily to the staff corridor, where the catering supervisor now stood half-turned away, speaking into her phone but not really listening to whoever was on the other end. A security officer leaned toward Richard. "Sir, we can escort the child to a quieter room," he said. "This is becoming disruptive to your guests." Lily heard it. She didn't protest. Instead, she pulled something else from her pocket, a small piece of napkin folded even tighter than before. On it was a faint stain of frosting and a partial fingerprint smudge. I wiped it before she came back, she said. She dropped something on the counter. She tried to hide it fast. The woman in gold exhaled softly, a sound that carried both patience and dismissal. This is why we have professionals, she said, turning slightly toward Richard now. You can review everything properly once the room is cleared of emotional interference. That word landed heavier than the rest. Lily didn't look at her. She looked at Richard instead. Not pleading, not afraid, just steady, as if waiting for him to decide whether facts required permission. Richard's gaze dropped briefly to her hand, then to the napkin, then toward the catering supervisor again. Show me her access badge history, he said suddenly, not to the room, but to the security lead. The woman in gold paused at that, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. The catering supervisor finally turned fully back toward them, too late to disguise the way her hand had instinctively moved toward her wrist. The security system beeped once from a tablet near the entry desk. Then it happened quietly, too quietly for something important. The system log refreshed, and for a fraction of a second, a new entry appeared under the catering supervisor's profile. Manual override, kitchen corridor, 3:11 to 3:17 p.m. Status updated 5 minutes ago. Richard saw it before it flickered away. His eyes didn't widen. He didn't speak. He simply looked up at the supervisor, and in that stillness, the woman in gold realized the correction she had just made was no longer in her control. Richard Harrington didn't move at first. His eyes stayed locked on the security tablet as the system log flickered again, then stabilized, then tried to hide itself behind a restored backup message that appeared too clean to be innocent. The woman in the pale gold dress stepped forward half a step, her voice still calm, still measured. Richard, these systems sometimes autocorrect after a manual review, she said gently. It's probably just a sync error. But he didn't look at her. Instead, his attention dropped to Lily Carter, who was still standing exactly where she had been since the beginning. Small hands clenched but steady, as if she had decided she would not be moved again. Slowly, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something else. Carefully, like it mattered more than anything in the room. It was a second piece of folded paper, thicker this time, edges slightly torn, as if it had been ripped away from something larger. She held it out without stepping forward. I didn't show this before, she said quietly, because she said no one would believe me if I didn't have proof. Richard finally took it. The moment his fingers touched the paper, Lily exhaled like she had been holding her breath for an hour. He unfolded it slowly. It wasn't a receipt this time. It was a partial kitchen schedule printout, internal, not meant for guests. On it, one line had been circled in faint red ink. Prep shift override. Anna Mitchell, 3:05 to 3:20 p.m. Kitchen corridor access granted. Beneath it, a second note had been added by hand, messy compared to the printed text. Requested by private liaison. No signature. No. Clearance ID. The room seemed to compress around that phrase. Richard read it again, slower. Then again. The words did not change, but something in his expression did. A memory surfaced, not fully formed, but sharp enough to disturb him. A conversation from 3 weeks ago in his office. A discussion about tightening internal trust layers before high-profile events. The suggestion had come from someone he had never questioned before. Someone who had always framed control as protection. The woman in gold shifted slightly behind him now. That document is incomplete, she said, still polite, still composed. You're reading a draft, not the final authorization. Lily immediately shook her head. No, she said, firmer now. She printed it like that. I saw her change the time with a pen before she walked into the kitchen. Richard's fingers tightened slightly on the paper, not crumpling it, but feeling its weight differently now. A soft sound came from the dessert table again, the pill bottle being moved, just a few inches this time, as someone tried to reposition it out of sight. Richard noticed. Everyone noticed, but no one acknowledged it. Instead, he turned slightly toward the catering supervisor again. Where were you between 3:05 and 3:20? He asked. The question was simple. Too simple. The supervisor hesitated for half a second too long. I was overseeing plating, she said. With staff. But her eyes flicked, just once, to the woman in gold. Lily noticed it too. Not because she understood alliances, but because she understood patterns. Her hand tightened around the napkin again. That's when she came back the second time, she said softly. After she dropped the bottle, she came back and checked if anyone moved it. The words didn't land like accusation. They landed like observation. Richard stepped back slightly from the table now, as if distance would help him see the entire structure instead of fragments. His gaze moved from the kitchen staff to the pill bottle, then to the kitchen corridor where access control panels blinked quietly, indifferent. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, his eyes shifted toward the woman in gold. She didn't react immediately. She simply held his gaze for a moment, too controlled, too still, as if waiting for him to remember something the room had already decided to forget. It was only when Richard finally looked away from the paper and said one name, quietly, without certainty, but with growing recognition, that the air changed. Not in the room, in her expression. Just for a fraction of a second, long enough for Lily to notice, and long enough for Richard to realize that the person he had trusted to oversee every detail of his life tonight had never once been questioned by anyone else in the room, because she had made sure of it. Richard Harrington did not speak after that name crossed the room. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He simply turned slightly away from the woman in gold, as if creating distance could sharpen thought. The ballroom noise softened into an indistinct background hum. Glassware, quiet footsteps, a distant laugh that no longer belonged to this moment. Lily Carter stayed still beside the dessert table, watching him carefully now, not with fear, but with the quiet patience of someone who had already said everything she knew how to say. Richard lifted his phone again. Not for the security feed this time, but for something older. A contact list buried under years of numbers he no longer called directly. He scrolled once, then stopped at a name that made no sense in this context, yet suddenly felt too present to ignore. He didn't dial. He simply copied a number into a secure message thread and sent a single line. I need the original kitchen authorization file for tonight. Unaltered. Then he locked the screen, as if ending the act of trust before it could become visible to anyone else. Behind him, the woman in gold moved closer again, careful, composed. Richard, you're letting an unsupervised child guide operational interpretation of a multi-layer event, she said softly. This is exactly how internal systems get compromised emotionally. Her tone was perfect. Measured concern, professional correction, no visible aggression. But Richard didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly toward the kitchen corridor where the faint glow of a wall clock reflected off. Stainless steel surfaces. It was 11:47 p.m., the same time window that matched the erased footage gap. Lily shifted for the first time in several minutes. I don't want anything, she said quietly, almost to herself. I just want her not to lie anymore. Richard looked down at her at that moment. Not at the table. Not at the system logs. Her. There was no expectation in her voice. No bargaining. No fear of loss or reward. Just a simple refusal to accept something she already understood was wrong. A soft domestic sound drifted from the far side of the kitchen. Someone wiping down a counter, water running briefly, then stopping. A television in the staff lounge played something low and indistinct, the kind of background noise meant to make late hours feel normal. Richard noticed something small then, something that had been there the entire time but never aligned correctly in his mind. The catering supervisor had never once looked at Lily directly since the second accusation. Not once. Not even when defending herself. His phone vibrated once on the table. A secure reply had arrived. He opened it without hesitation. The file was a scanned original authorization log. Unedited. Unmodified. And there it was, clear, unambiguous, unchanged. The prep corridor override had been signed off at 3:04 p.m. by a system profile that should not have had clearance for internal kitchen adjustments. The profile name matched the woman in gold. But beneath it, a secondary line showed something older, something deeper in system history. A dormant administrative credential reactivated 3 weeks ago, under Richard's own trust hierarchy, a credential he had personally approved during a restructuring meeting. He lowered the phone slowly. The room didn't feel louder, felt narrower. His gaze drifted past the woman in gold, past the catering staff, past the dessert table still holding the untouched cake. And for the first time since the evening began, Richard Harrington didn't look like a man trying to solve a problem. He looked like a man realizing that he had been relying on a version of control that someone else had quietly rewritten long before tonight ever began, and that he had been the one who signed off on trusting it. Richard Harrington did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence he created by simply standing still was heavier than any accusation. The woman in gold remained composed, but for the first time her hands were no longer perfectly still. They rested lightly on the edge of the dessert table, as if anchoring herself to something physical. Lily Carter stood beside Richard now, not hiding behind him, but not stepping forward either. Just present. Watching. Richard placed his phone flat on the table, screen facing up. "Run it again," he said calmly. "Not to the room. To the security lead. The authorization chain. From origin. Not the mirrored backup." A technician hesitated, then complied. The screen beside them began to reload system logs in real time. A faint loading circle spun slowly, almost politely, as if unaware of the tension pressing into the room. The woman in gold gave a small, controlled smile. "Richard, this level of redundancy check will take time. We can review everything tomorrow with proper audit teams." "No," Richard interrupted softly. "Not sharp. Just final enough to stop her sentence mid-air." That single word made even the staff behind her stop moving. Lily leaned slightly toward Richard and pointed, not at the screen, but at the kitchen doorway. "That's where she looked at the clock," she said, "right before she changed her gloves." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Richard followed her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, as if storing it in a place no one else could see. The catering supervisor shifted closer to the exit corridor without fully turning her body. It was subtle, almost polite, like someone stepping back to give space. But Richard noticed it. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he reached for the pill bottle on the table with 2 fingers and placed it slightly closer to the center, aligning it under the chandelier light. "Let's remove all interpretations," he said quietly. "Just facts." A staff member behind the supervisor's shoulder swallowed hard and adjusted a headset that wasn't transmitting anything. The woman in gold exhaled gently, almost like reassurance. "Facts require context," she said. "Otherwise, we risk turning coincidence into narrative." Richard finally looked directly at her. Not with anger, with something far more precise. "Then explain the missing 6 minutes without narrative," he said. A soft vibration broke the stillness. One of the kitchen phones on a side cart lit up briefly, then dimmed again without being answered. The screen showed an incoming file transfer, security footage restoration in progress. The loading bar crawled forward, slow and deliberate. 12%. 13%. Lily's eyes stayed fixed on the screen. "She checked the oven timer twice," she said suddenly. But the oven wasn't even on. That small detail landed differently now. Richard didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the catering supervisor instead. The supervisor smiled faintly, too quickly. "Children misremember sequences under stress," she said again, repeating the phrase like it had been prepared for repetition. Richard stepped slightly to the side, placing himself between the supervisor and the exit corridor. Not blocking her, just changing geometry. "What time did you enter the kitchen corridor?" he asked gently. "I already told you," she replied, still composed. 3:05 p.m. The loading bar on the screen jumped to 78%. A faint clicking sound came from the server unit behind the wall. The woman in gold turned her head slightly toward the kitchen staff, then back to Richard, her expression still carefully balanced. But Lily noticed something shift in her eyes. Not fear yet, not panic, but recognition that the room was no longer aligned the way it had been before. Richard's phone vibrated once more. A second file had arrived. This one was older system metadata, keycard access patterns over the past month. He didn't open it immediately. He didn't need to. He already understood what it would show. Instead, he looked at the woman in gold again and said, almost gently, "You didn't just adjust tonight's log, did you?" For the first time, she didn't answer right away. And in that pause, small, controlled, but unmistakable, she realized the child beside him was no longer the only reason the room was watching her. The room did not erupt, tightened. Every sound that followed felt delayed, as if the building itself needed a moment to decide whether it was allowed to react. Richard Harrington stood motionless, eyes fixed on the woman in gold, while the security screen beside him finally completed its load. The progress bar hit 100%. Then the system autoplayed the restored segment. On the screen, the kitchen corridor appeared at 3:11 p.m. clear, uninterrupted. The catering supervisor walking in alone, checking the oven that was not on, adjusting her gloves once, then twice. But at 3:14 p.m., something changed in the footage. Not a glitch, but a cut that had been stitched back incorrectly. A frame froze just long enough to show a second figure entering from the side corridor. Not recorded before, not acknowledged after. The figure held something small in her hand. A white bottle. Lily Carter stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Pause it there," she said quietly. The technician hesitated, then obeyed. The frame locked. Lily pointed not at the bottle but at the clock above the kitchen wall in the footage. "That clock is wrong," she said. "It's fast by 3 minutes. I told him earlier." Richard turned slowly toward her. "Earlier when?" he asked. "When she dropped the bottle," Lily replied. "I saw her look up at that clock before she came back out. She wasn't checking time. She was checking if it matched the hallway clock." The woman in gold finally moved. Not forward, not back, just slightly to the side, as if trying to reposition herself outside the center of attention. "Richard," she said softly, "you're letting reconstructed footage dictate interpretation instead of verified chain of custody logs. That is not how internal compliance works." But Richard didn't look at her. He was staring at the second figure on the screen. He didn't recognize the angle of entry, not from any approved staff route. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization. He reached for the tablet and expanded metadata. A secondary audio track surfaced beneath the video, faint but intact. A voice, calm, measured, familiar in a way that took longer than it should have to place. "After the cake is served, everything proceeds as planned," the voice said. "No deviaciones." The catering supervisor's face changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough for the absence of confidence to become visible. "That's not complete context," she said quickly. "That's a clipped segment." Richard raised a hand, not to silence her, but to stop the room from moving further ahead of him. He replayed the audio again, slower, then again. The voice did not change. Lily was still looking at the screen, but now her attention had shifted to something else. The way the woman in gold was no longer watching the footage. She was watching Richard, waiting, measuring. Richard finally spoke, but his voice was quieter than before. "Who authorized a secondary corridor entry at 3:14 p.m.? No answer came immediately. The catering supervisor looked toward the woman in gold, just for a fraction of a second too long. That was enough. Richard exhaled once, slowly. Then he looked down at the pill bottle again, now placed directly under the chandelier light like evidence that had finally been allowed to exist in full visibility. His hand moved toward it, but he didn't touch it yet. Instead, he adjusted his cuff, a small, controlled motion, as if anchoring himself to something still familiar. "You said this system was secure," he said, finally addressing the woman in gold directly. "I said it was redundant," she replied softly, "not immune to misinterpretation." Lily stepped slightly closer to Richard, her voice almost disappearing into the space between them. "She went back twice," she said. The second time, she wasn't alone. That was when Richard stopped looking at the screen entirely. His eyes moved past the footage, past the room, past the explanation still trying to form. And for the first time since the evening began, he looked at the woman in gold as if seeing not a colleague, not a guest, but a structure he had once trusted without ever asking how it held itself up. He reached for the pill bottle then, not to accuse, not to react, just to place it carefully in the center of the table, aligned perfectly under the light, as if preparing it for something far larger. Then the room was ready to admit. Then he looked at his security lead and said, evenly, "Call my attorney." The attorney arrived without ceremony, as if the night itself had been waiting for him to appear. Richard Harrington did not repeat the story. He did not need to. He simply placed the pill bottle, the printed log, and the security tablet on the table in a straight line, like pieces of a single sentence finally allowed to be read aloud. The woman in gold remained standing, perfectly still now, her composure held together by habit rather than certainty. The attorney listened once, then asked no unnecessary questions. Instead, he turned to his assistant and spoke quietly into a secured line. Within minutes, the room's perimeter shifted. Security presence doubled, not aggressive, not chaotic, just precise. Guests were guided away from the dessert hall under the explanation of technical review protocols. No one argued. In spaces like this, confusion always sounded like authority when delivered calmly enough. Lily Carter stayed exactly where she was. She did not run when the room began to empty. She did not hide when the voices lowered into professional tones that no longer belonged to celebration. Richard noticed that before anything else. The attorney noticed it too. The child was not watching the chaos. She was watching the truth being organized. A second team reviewed the footage independently. The 6-minute gap was no longer treated as a technical issue. It was reconstructed frame by frame. The second entry into the kitchen corridor appeared again, this time cross-referenced with badge metadata that had been manually overridden. The signature attached to the override matched the catering supervisor's profile, but the authorization source traced back to a higher-tier access key, one that required executive trust clearance. Richard did not speak when that detail surfaced. He only looked at the woman in gold. For the first time, her expression changed, not into panic, not into denial, but into the recognition that explanation no longer mattered. The attorney stepped slightly forward and confirmed, in a voice that carried no emotion at all, that internal systems had been deliberately altered to conceal entry timing and ingredient handling in the kitchen corridor. The catering supervisor was the first to be escorted out of the room. She did not resist. She did not speak. She only looked once at the floor as if trying to remember where the decision had stopped being hers. The woman in gold followed moments later, still silent, her presence no longer requiring interpretation. No spectacle followed. No confrontation. Just removal. Quiet, procedural, final. When the doors closed, the air in the room changed temperature. Not warmer, not colder, just lighter, as if something invisible had finally stopped pressing down. Richard exhaled slowly and turned toward Lily for the first time in several minutes. "You were right," he said simply. "No embellishment. No distance. Just recognition." Lily looked down at her hands for a moment, as if unsure what to do with that sentence. Then she shook her head slightly. "I just didn't want him to eat it," she said. "That's all." Outside the dessert hall, staff confirmed the cake had been secured and tested. Nothing had been consumed. The night's guests were informed only that the event would continue in a revised format. Most would never know what had been sitting beneath the frosting 10 minutes earlier. Richard removed his jacket and gently placed it over Lily's shoulders without asking. She did not refuse it. A staff member quietly brought a small glass of milk and set it on the table near her, hesitating before stepping away. Lily stared at it for a moment, then drank without ceremony, as if the simplest things had become the most certain again. The attorney handed Richard a final report draft for immediate filing. Richard did not open it yet. Instead, he looked at Lily and then at the space where the chaos had been cleared away. The room no longer felt like a battlefield of accusations. It felt like something being corrected in real time, carefully, deliberately, without celebration. Lily set the empty glass down and looked up at him. "Is it over?" she asked softly. Richard paused before answering, not because he didn't know, but because he understood what the question really meant. Then, he nodded once. "The lie is," he said, and in the quiet that followed, no one in the room argued with that anymore.